Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from... My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we speak to cultural anthropologist, researcher, and practitioner Ben Joffe. Ben's particular areas of expertise include the anthropology of magic, the Tibetan diaspora, ritual, and esotericism. Ben, welcome aboard.
Hello.
All right, Mr. Joffe, dialing in from a university in South Africa in almost the middle of the night. Thank you very much for being so accommodating. But Ben, were you a weird kid? Question one.
I most certainly was a weird kid. I think that maybe it was a bit overdetermined. I checked a number of boxes. I'm a special needs. I was a special needs child. I was born 11 and a half weeks early and spent the first 2 odd months of my life in an incubator. I'm also queer. So I guess that already kind of the beginning of my life was highly medicalized. People were treating me as special in other ways. And so my kind of burgeoning interest in the occult sort of, in some ways, was combined with that as well.
Just to interrupt there, Ben, because this is take 2 of our attempts at the discussions, because we had Skype gremlins yesterday. But
yeah.
I was thinking about the sort of premature birth thing, because a very dear friend of mine had a kid 18 months ago, and she was very premature, right? And if you had been born at any other time, you would have died. So
right.
You're actually there is a sort of there is a shape to that looks like the kind of going to the other side and being back. You're already liminal from sort of day one, because had you been...
yeah. And I mean, for me, I was in an incubator for, as I say, about 2 months, and I've sometimes wondered whether having that experience, you're being fed by tubes, they cover your eyes because you're so sensitive to light, your lungs are underdeveloped. So in some ways, you are really kind of immobilized, and you're in this warm, dark space, this sort of second womb. And I've often sort of just, casually wondered whether that has had any impact on who I turned out to be later in life. My earliest moments were spent in a kind of retreat. And I wondered if the kind of more hermit-like aspects of my nature were sort of in some ways.
That's where you picked up the habit. In your first few weeks of life, you picked up the hermit habit. Nice.
Yeah. So I don't know. And also this kind of impatience with, do I really need to be doing this incarnation thing? And if I'm doing it, what is this all about? And kind of having a certain impatience about spending time dealing with things that seem overly banal or whatever. I've always had the feeling that I was kind of living on borrowed time. And when you are a child who narrowly scraped death, a lot of the narrative is built around the idea that it's amazing that you even made it. So I'm sure, it is an interesting thing to think about. The premature birth did give me cerebral palsy. I'm not sure if it gave me anything else, but it is kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, for sure. So let's pick up the story from. I mean, we're a few minutes in and we haven't left the hospital yet, but carry on with the story of Ben.
Well, I grew up in a pretty a-religious family. My father was a kind of mild-mannered, lapsed Jew atheist, and my mother didn't have much interest in religion, so we didn't really get any spirituality or religion from home. But from a very young age, it was clear that I had an interest in these kinds of things. I definitely felt like I was always wanting to find out more about I guess what you could call hidden realities. As a child, I was quite introspective and brooding. I didn't really have human friends for the first years of my life, and strangely, for a lot of my friends now, I didn't talk a lot. I spent a lot of time with animals. Another check on the weirdness box was I used to be a bat rehabilitator as well. So in my hometown South Africa, I spent a lot of time rearing wild and injured animals, bats in particular. And so I did that from a very young age, from about 7 or 8. Um, so it's kind of weird to me now that I'm an anthropologist and that I spend so much time dealing with ostensibly human realities. Um, but but yeah, I mean, there was a lot of weirdness to go around, but I think it all sort of cemented when my grandmother, she was I wouldn't say she was a witch, but she was witchy. She she aspired to witch status. She had a kind of aesthetic that she preferred, which was kind of uh, I think the dark allure of the witch was something she built her personality around. She was an unconventional woman for her time. She had like 5 marriages and um, dressed in flamboyant ways, and she had never studied the occult or anything like that in any formal sense. But I think she had a passing interest, and as a kind of witch monkey, she saw in me these interests and encouraged them to a certain extent. And so I think it was my 10th or 11th Christmas when her and my mother conspired together to buy me my first tarot deck and a book on occultism. It was one of those big coffee table things, lots of pictures, just a general survey. But that book, along with the tarot deck, was kind of the instigation for a lot of what came next. And I started reading tarot from about the age of 11, and I started doing that professionally. And I guess I would say that was the launching point for a lot of my more formal exploration into occultism and esotericism.
What's the sort of thought process that goes through both an 11-year-old's head and his parents' head to say, I would, at the age of 11, like to be a professional tarot reader? And what was day one like?
Um, well, it was funny. Like for me, I was just kind of quite naively and blindly just pursuing things that made sense to me. I feel like my mother and grandmother maybe they kind of got it. They had labels for it all, or they sort of knew which section of the bookstore to go to, at least at that point. And they thought, well, let's try this out. Let's like throw this at them and see what happens. And I took to it quite naturally. I started reading for friends and family within 1 week of getting the cards. And there was this South Africa had a kids network at the time, kids TV network, and they used to do this annual entrepreneurial kind of, to promote business sense in children. And I remember with my mom's help, I applied and had a little trestle table, and she and my sister sold herbs and homemade candles and other suitably hokey, new agey things. And I divined for people at this open air flea market, and I mean, people were saying to me after that one day, "Where can I find you again?" And I didn't really know what to say to them. And then I was given the suggestion that I go to this open air flea market in my hometown, a nice park that was near to where I lived, which every Saturday they would have craftsmen and people would sell things at trestle tables. And so the owner of the park let me bring my own small table and not pay any kind of fee. And yeah, I mean, I still remember day one. I was on the outskirts of the park at that time. A bit later, I joined forces with the kind of one incense and crystal table there, where I made a lot of my sort of initial kind of witchy and new age contacts as a child. But before that, I was by myself, and I was squatting next to this South African Mauritian woman who sold kind of costume jewelry and fake and real fur coats. And I remember she sat down as my first official client. And she said to me, "Tell me, should I divorce my husband?" And, I mean, well, I was 11, but I read for her, and, she was satisfied with the answer. And, I was sweating, but the rest was kind of history because I guess at that time it just made sense. I didn't think overly about it, overly much about it, I
I
just,
think you'd
I kind
probably
of,
have. I think you'd probably get my money. Like I've had my fortune told by a bird in Hong Kong. So if I saw an 11-year-old kid at a flea market, throwing cards, I'd be, yeah, all right. I think there's quite a good business angle there. I mean, it's a child labor angle, but there's
It,
quite a good business angle there.
my father still sometimes plays up on that angle, even now when I read for acquaintances and friends of his, like kind of feigns that he's taking the money and he's making me work, you know, long hours in the sweatshop, in the psychic sweatshop. But but yeah, I mean, both my parents they were divorced at that time, but they would, take turns bringing me to the market, and I had a little sign. There was even a period where I shudder to mention that I wore a paper witch's hat actually that my mother had made. So it was cheesy as you can imagine.
Are
But
there are
as
there photos of this atrocity?
there are photos somewhere.
Excellent.
I'm not going to seek them out too readily. But
No.
yeah, and as time went on, my own relationship with the tarot and with other forms of divination evolved. At that point, I was doing a lot of I was doing a lot of different things. I was reading with dye. I was reading with colored stones that I would throw. But later on, I started reading runes. I dabbled in palmistry. Um, Never really cracked like in-depth astrology, but I was really mercurial and I was looking all over the place. And I guess you could say tarot was my first love. And for better or worse, it's kind of dumping ground of esoteric symbolism, from this moment in history where tarot becomes sort of portrayed as a sort of uh, key for hermeticism and all kinds of secret sciences. And so what that allowed me to do was kind of, I was overwhelmed by a lot of associations and histories and connections, and I kind of just worked backwards from there. And my parents, thankfully, this was way over their heads, and they had no personal interest. But the good news was that they just, in some ways, they enabled me, or at least humored me, and um, they just said, well, this is what you're interested in, and if you feel this urgency to pursue knowledge about these things, then by all means. And yeah, my mother sewed my first black towel robe um, when I was 12. They were very accommodating, even if they were kind of scratching their heads throughout the whole process. Um,
And was it principally, when you say tarot was your first love? I mean, you just mentioned a whole bunch of other divinatory systems. Was that the kind of adolescent interest in particular, that sort of sortilege, divination, fortune telling, rather than waking the dead?
I think what happened for me was that I think the next step from tarot was an interest in neo-paganism. Uh, I actually had when I was in I guess what Americans would call grade school. Because of my physical handicap, I had a kind of doctor's note to not do school sport, but I did actually go once a week for extramural witchcraft lessons. I had found when I was 12, I read for the mother of a teenage girl who sort of slipped me a phone number of a lady that she said could help me. Very mysterious. And I called her. She was sort of a suburban trophy wife, but she was also a witch. I guess today I would say maybe a witch in common garden varieties, sort of Gardnerian Wiccan perhaps, or sort of eclectic witch. But she insisted that my parents meet her, but I gave her this sweaty palm phone call when I was about 12, but she agreed to take me on as a student, and because this particular client had seen that I'd started reading more about neo-paganism. So I had this brief flirtation with Wicca, and I had this sort of weekly witch mentor in the suburbs we mostly just spoke about kind of psychology and about. Um, we also spoke about anthropology. Actually, we read Isaac Bonavitz's Real Magic, and we kind of had weekly classes, and we would talk about what would make someone interested in magic and the occult, and I quickly realized that I wasn't particularly driven to join a coven or engage with witchcraft as a religion, not at that point. And I realized I was interested in magic, and really what happened in that time of being at that flea market, and I was surrounded by all of these matronly women, all of these new age types, but they were just so wonderfully and bewilderingly diverse. This one was into feng shui. This one was a Reiki master, level 5. This one was into aliens. This one had recently converted to Soto Zen. This one was a white sangoma, which is a South African word for a sort of traditional African ancestral spirit medium. This one was, on and on. And so I realized that in order to make sense of my own kind of, for the want of a better word, childhood paranormal experiences, and all of these things that all these adults were telling me, I would need to have context. And so I think from an early age, I was just enthused to do my own research, find my own mentors, and just make comparisons and try to make sense of the fact that all of these people, myself included, were saying that they'd had these kind of pretty profound and transformative spiritual experiences, but they were all coming at it from very different paradigms. And so yeah, I was really trying to kind of find different perspectives on making sense of all this, because my experience was that as sort of kooky and ditzy and uninformed in a technical sense as some of them may have been, they were all quite sincere and, not always well-adjusted, but usually well-adjusted, ordinary people, but who were engaging with these other realities. And as I say, it wasn't anything I was getting directly from home, but I guess that was also the beginning of anthropology. This attitude of looking at things in their own context and understanding them as part of lived practice and comparing them to bigger patterns, historicizing them, contextualizing them, and doing it in a way that was critical but also wasn't ridiculing. Finding some kind of sense in the midst of all of that esoteric diversity.
Well, yes, I think it's interesting that magic led you to anthropology rather than the other way around. Uh, it's something that you have to solve in your head. I mean, you describe these different people at the market, for instance, as kooky, and I have no doubt they are. I'm sure we've all met exactly the kind of people you were referring to. But there's no getting around the fact that whatever they are experiencing is real. It's not a delusion. So you're kind of in this step one of going, okay, well, what's the best way of interrogating this sort of multiple reality experience that I'm moving through? And my next question was going to be why anthropology, but I think you answered that, Ben. So
Yeah.
the question after that, because I think you've led this up very nicely, is what even is anthropology?
Well, it depends where you are in the world, actually. It's a very kind of very particular field. The intellectual genealogies are different in kind of British anthropology, American anthropology. But basically, it's the study of human beings and human experience. And by American standards, I'm a cultural anthropologist. Here in South Africa, we would call it a social anthropologist. The more compromising few call it socio-cultural anthropology. But essentially, yeah, I mean, what we usually tell our students is that anything that human beings do is amenable to study by an anthropologist. My advisor has a kind of regular challenge, which he gets our freshmen in the room and says, I dare you to try to find anything that an anthropologist has not written a book about. And they routinely fail. So I think the stereotype is that anthropology is about the study of kind of pre-modern, non-Western society beliefs and practices, small-scale societies. Certainly that was the kind of colonial origins of the discipline. But now, really, it's more about the orientation we take to studying human experience. And, I mean, I spend a lot of my time thinking about aliens, for example, but you also can't think about extraterrestrialism without thinking about humans either. So basically, we're always looking at, I feel like anthropology is typified by this kind of willingness to immerse oneself over long periods of time and pay attention to kinds of knowledge that often are often not credited as being knowledge in the same way. You can learn a lot about what anthropology is by what its detractors say. They tend to say that it's narrative, it's anecdotal, it's overly subjective and reflexive. But our counterpoint is always that those things are the biggest strength in our discipline. They provide us an angle on the diversity of human experience and history that you can't find in any other way or through other approaches.
It's a fascinating field because, as you kind of mentioned, it did emerge as something of an imperial hobby. You put anthropology alongside um, Joseph Banks' naturalism of going out and actually just drawing the shape of the Australian flora. There is a kind of creepy opening weeks of the Natural History Museum kind of origin story, which I think becomes fascinating because of how much it's transformed and in the last, say, 80 years, 60 years, maybe a bit less, it has anthropologized itself to work out, well, what is the wider story and so on. And I think it's a very valuable way of. I think it's a meta or kind of hyper discipline because the first thing anthropology seems to discuss is anthropology using anthropological methods, and from there go out to kind of explore the world. So, I mean, my favorite thing, it's 20 years old now, but when De Castro called anthropology comparative metaphysics, I think is a very useful. Yeah, I think it's a very useful way of how to describe anthropology to people who may have previously been detractors, because it's a set of skills or patterns of thinking that can be very valuable. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And yeah, there's always been a speculative dimension to that comparativism. I mean, anthropologists have always gone out and said, look, like, what you consider to be natural, obvious, given, we call it the anthropological veto. Any pronouncement you might make about the normal and natural order of things, an anthropologist can quietly raise their hand in the back of the room and say, well, I've spent 30 years living in some place in some time with some people, which shows that you can order your life disregarding those things. So comparative metaphysics, yeah, I mean, this particular term comes out of the last 20 years. It's what anthropologists have been calling the ontological turn. It's quite esoteric if you haven't been following kind of cutting edge anthropology, social science theory. But yeah, the basic idea is really challenging. It's what we've always been doing as anthropologists, really challenging the idea of kind of essential and natural and obvious ideas about what it means to be alive as a human being. But where it gets really exciting and messy and interesting is that you have to do that as a human being who's uniquely positioned. As you say, we long ago gave up this fiction that we were going out as, kind of racist, distinguished white gentlemen, kind of measuring skulls and describing cultural realities. What we do is intersubjective. We are studying human experiences by being part of them, and while we are positioned in very particular ways. No book written by an anthropologist about one part of the world or one subject is ever repeatable, simply because no anthropologist is repeatable. We have a shared set of training, but again, often this is seen as detracting from the kind of scientific weight, this idea of non-repeatability, and you have to describe what you discovered using language, and using a culture of anthropology. You're studying culture through an academic culture, through a particular set of discourses. It seems doomed from the start, but in some ways, this as you said, hyper-reflexivity, this meta approach can be very revealing as well, because I feel like there are very few other disciplines that really require you to use yourself as a human being your own consciousness and body, embodiment, as the primary barometer for research, as the primary tool of measurement. And so, in some ways, I've always felt that the kinds of exercises that sort of post-Crowleyan ritual magic have asked practitioners to do are very similar. We also keep journals. We also say that you can learn something by testing variables and putting yourself in extreme situations, stretching the limits of consciousness and what makes you you, and whether that's contextual or essential, or how does that change based on circumstance. What happens if you speak a different language? Talk to beings you've never met before. I've always thought that even in a poetic sense, there's remarkable similarities between contemporary magical practice, at least, as I say, in the kind of Crowleyan keep a journal sense, and anthropology.
Well, so, it is patently a school of magic. I mean, it's people wandering around the world. They may have different motives, but they're behaviorally observing them. Anthropologists go and we were just talking about the Thai occult, or the sort of occult or animist landscape of Thailand before we hit the record button. Now, if anthropologists go out there engaging with and interacting with the animist landscape of Thailand, they're doing the same thing some kind of greedy fucking wizard would do. Like, I want to know how to make these things, or I want to know what the right names for these spirits are. The anthropologist may not use them, but nevertheless, he or she has acquired that and absorbed it into a worldview and an experience, and they're kind of building sometimes non-practicing wizards.
Yeah, I think, I mean, of course, I know other anthropologists would say that that's not good enough. One of the things that it's not just about our personal transformation. That's a given. But one of the things that we also are always trying to do is put that in conversation with, put that experience and those discoveries in conversation with kind of much larger. This is something people often miss with anthropology. It's not merely about, it's not travel writing alone. It's not just about what I did on my holidays. It's also about putting that information, that very grassroots, ground up information, in conversation with historical patterns, in conversation with broader archives of knowledge and theory, and also about generating theory that can speak back to the kind of naturalisms that we're just sort of received wisdom of our own societies and other societies, and kind of use that knowledge from the ground up to look at bigger structures, and the kind of usual ones being kind of neoliberal capitalism, all the big baddies of our current Anthropocene age.
Certainly. Well, funny enough, when you were saying that detractors would consider it unscientific because the primary sort of experimental or experiential tool in anthropology is the body. It's the opposite. It's basically the only scientific. That's being unfair, but I love the idea that the thing that a materialist would consider unscientific, or a rationalist, is the opposite, because they're in that worldview with their body experiencing it. And anthropology is kind of annoying to people who maybe don't have that nuance, or are panicked by the nuance in worldviews that are required.
Right, you're always implicated and you're always situated, and this is something that you can't really escape. My biggest sort of personal critique of a lot of these developments that I briefly mentioned before, the ontological turn and De Castros and people like this, is that they're working at a very kind of, to me, it feels very unethnographic. They're talking about, they're standardizing worldviews. They're saying Amerindian animists think like this, and we can counter this to kind of modernist Cartesian thinking, or whatever it might be. But for me, this is very problematic, because, as any anthropologist will tell you, get to the field, talk to real people, become invested and involved, and you'll realize that these kinds of neat models fall apart within one day. And for me, that's always been it's simultaneously frustrating and wonderful, because this is what human life is all about. It's constantly changing, and when Malinowski, the father of field work was, he famously says at the beginning of his book on the Trobriand Islanders that had such an impact in the discipline and that really sort of set immersive field work up as a kind of sine qua non of anthropology. He says at the beginning, he says, imagine if you were dropped with all your gear on the shore of a remote island. You watch the ship that brought you sail away, and he uses this kind of this narrative trick to draw his readers into the anthropological fieldwork experience. But now, of course, as you said, we anthropologists spend a lot of time just sort of critiquing our own history and sort of peering through our own gut. We now, his personal diaries, which were his non-fieldwork diaries, have been published. We know all the travails and turmoil he went through in his personal life, and a lot of it wasn't very pretty and looked pretty racist from where we sit today, looked very alienated. And on top of that, we also, he never interrogated he never mentioned what the broader political, economic, social circumstances were that even allowed him to be on the island. That ship didn't come from nowhere. He was actually doing field work because he was, in a sense, in stasis because of the war. He was Polish and he actually couldn't go home. So there are all these realities that he didn't mention in his, groundbreaking research. But now that's the great part. Like Malinowski never dreamed that when he published theories about Trobriand Islanders, that the grandchild of one of his key informants would be sitting in his lecture seminar. But now that will happen. And we live in a very different kind of world where the onus is on us as researchers more than ever to recognize how implicated we are and how much that is part of producing better knowledge, understanding in deeper and more sophisticated ways how the production of knowledge happens in the kind of worlds that we are living in right now.
And was it love at first sight? Was day one Anthropology 101 or whatever it was? Was it like, yeah, this is for me. This is what I'm going to do?
No, I didn't even know what anthropology was. I was doing a archaeology class because it's a long story, but I got my tuition paid because of a clause in my father's contract if I studied a major at a different university that wasn't offered at his original university where he taught. So I was just doing archaeology, and it wasn't totally my thing, as interesting as it was. And then we did a joint social anthropology and archaeology class, and I thought, this is interesting. We get to talk about things that we aren't touching on too deeply, about ritual and cosmology and things that weren't, glanced upon in archaeology. And honestly, the first 3 years, maybe even the first 4 years, I had no idea what was going on. We were reading all these fascinating case studies, but none of it felt coherent. I didn't really understand what the point of it all was. And really, because it is such a self-reflexive discipline that's constantly kind of self-immolating, it's always sort of, anthropologists are always crowing about how it's the end of the discipline or it's the end of this, grand concept that has informed so much of our thinking. They love to think this way, and so it keeps you on your toes. But I still won't claim that I know exactly what's going on. And we certainly don't really we no longer have theoretical schools per se, like we may have once did for a short time. Anthropologists tend to be very kind of piecemeal and magpie-ish with how they draw on theory, even though theory is very sort of important to what we do. So it is a little bit of a mess. We've had various turns and crises. The way we teach the kind of intellectual genealogies of the discipline is always in terms of this language, that the crisis of representation, when anthropologists realized that they were writers before all else, and so they had to pay attention to the fact that they were dealing above all else with narrative. And then now we have, well, as I say, we have the ontological turn, which already has seen just a welter of reviews and counter reviews and critiques. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting time. Now anthropologists are saying that we need to be thinking in terms of the Anthropocene, the age of human impact and expanse, and that what that means is that we can no longer have this provincial attitude towards the human experience. And if we are really anthropologists, we need to be engaging with multi-species anthropology. We need to be engaging with much broader scopes of kind of, it makes the ordinary idea of intersectionality sort of quite pedestrian. We now have anthropologists and social theorists like Donna Haraway writing about lichen. We have as part of writing about microbes and lichen and gut flora as an important part of anthropological sort of theorizing. And so the question of where the limits of the human even lies always remains sort of fraught and in flux.
And that's a really good way of describing it. We might have to pick up a couple of them, but what was it? I mean, you've done research. No, let me do this. Why Tibet, Ben? And the story will emerge from there.
The first actual sort of major fieldwork I did was actually with neo-pagans in South Africa. That was in 2008. And I was captivated by this moment in South African history when most neo-pagans in South Africa are kind of upper middle class and white. Not all of them, but that's kind of the broad demographic. And so white South Africans have only ever represented about 9% of the total population. And here you had this demographic of people kind of speaking in the name of witchcraft and saying that they practiced a benign nature religion. And then meanwhile, the majority of South African citizens were black South Africans whose idea of witchcraft was very different. And so my first research wasn't related to Tibet. I was actually looking at how white witches, in both senses of the word, had come together with African traditional healers mutually to push back against colonial era legislature, which was anti-witchcraft legislature that was in place to protect against witchcraft-related violence, because we still have lynchings in South Africa from time to time, and these laws, which are still supposedly in place and that the police could draw upon, kind of criminalize professing. It's kind of like the Fraudulent Mediums Act, criminalize professing magical powers or sort of trading in magical goods and these sorts of things. So I was absolutely captivated by the idea that you had these very sort of seemingly disparate groups, both coming together around legal and political issues, around identity, around history, different notions of cultural rights. Because the claim in this case was that both sort of African spirit mediums and Wiccans were saying that their religious rights had been sort of denied in this colonial era legislature. Anyway, I worked in that area for a short while and felt a little bit uncomfortable about whether I would continue studying people who felt quite close to myself. And yeah, I don't know. I don't really have it's hard to know what to say. I was interested in Buddhism, and especially Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana, Tantric Buddhism, but didn't know much about it. I was feeling uncomfortable about pursuing a kind of pagan studies direction after that brief foray into that research I just mentioned now. And I had started studying Tibetan language. The best explanation I can give is that whenever I have a lot of other things to do, kind of difficult academic things, I often procrastinate or rebel by doing other difficult academic things that aren't related to that thing I have to do. So I think many years ago I had to write an essay on something for an anthropology class. So instead I thought, why don't I learn a new language? So I went to the library and I thought, well, I'm interested in finding out more about Buddhism. Why don't I learn Tibetan? Does the University of Cape Town even have a Tibetan language book? So I went into the library and I found one from 1901, written by Sir Charles Bell. It could be worse, actually, as a grammar book. But, so I started teaching myself Tibetan without ever having met a Tibetan. And then I spoke to my advisor at the time here in Cape Town, and I said, maybe I'm interested in looking at the politics of Buddhism in South Africa and looking at Buddhist converts and how they fit into the broader picture of religious pluralism in the country. And then she said, well, how do you know there aren't Tibetans in South Africa? And so I said, don't be ridiculous. Why would there be Tibetans in South Africa? But turns out there were. In 2009, there were 2 Tibetan families, and I subsequently discovered a 3rd Tibetan family that the other 2 didn't even know about, living in South Africa. The 2 primary families were here because they had been sent as sort of de facto ambassadors of the what's now called the Tibetan Exile Administration. It used to be known as the Central Tibetan Administration, the CTA. It used to be known as the Tibetan Government in Exile. But, the Tibetan Exile Administration runs these sort of de facto embassies all over the world. The country of Tibet is not recognized in any sort of political or judicial sense as having any actual existence in terms of international law. But exiled Tibetan representatives man these offices and try to keep the issue of Tibetan rights and freedom alive. And as it happened, there was one such embassy, Tibet House, in South Africa. And so I took a bus and I went to the heart of Afrikaner suburbia where they were and met them and tried out a few shaky phrases of Tibetan and then ended up doing a master's project where I interned for about 5 or 6 months at that office and was just really fascinated to try to understand how they were positioning themselves politically, socially. They were a non-community in some respects because there were no other Tibetans around them. There was no sort of Tibetan cultural worlds that they could easily fold themselves into, like they might have if they were in South Asia. But here they were on a mission, following a mandate from higher institutions in the Tibetan diaspora, and a lot of the research ended up being about how they fit into kind of broader sorts of circulations of information and broader diasporic communities. Because what I quickly realized was that they were a part of a scattered community that was in many ways mediated by mass media and social media, and yet at the same time they were interacting with. They were ostensibly meant to be in South Africa to be engaging with political authorities. But this was just after the Dalai Lama had been denied a visa for the first time to come to South Africa because of geopolitical issues involving China, South Africa, and Tibetans. And so they were basically stymied, and they spent most of their time interacting with kind of white converts to Tibetan Buddhism and New Agey types, who are some of the kind of many, not always, but often they're some of the sort of most apolitical people you could ever wish to meet. So it was a fascinating thing, and I guess you can probably see. For me, what's always been interesting, and I think it goes back to those early days at the flea market, it was trying to understand how people were engaging around similar terms and experiences, but they were coming from very different backgrounds and where their political subjectivities were very different. And so I think a lot of this early research has now led me, subsequent to that, I was studying Tibetan by myself, but I realized if I wanted to, get specialized training in Tibetan studies, I'd have to go somewhere else. South Africa just doesn't have that. So I started a PhD program at the University of Colorado, which I'm about to finish now. And so now I've done many months of field work in India and Nepal with Tibetan communities. But I think my interests have remained the same. For me, I've always been fascinated about this kind of relationship between, I guess, what you could call indigenous ritual specialists and neo-shamans, neo-specialists. Here you had the white witches talking to witch doctors. You have white converts to Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, a lot of my research really does revolve around the sort of complexities of this, because I think it's very easy to kind of polarize these issues, but it really gets to the heart of the ways in which knowledge and practices are being transmitted today across communities, and it really sort of challenges essentialist ideas of culture and identity. With Tibetans, it's really interesting because they have I guess you could say they have I mean, Buddhism on paper, at any rate, is a universalist faith. I've sometimes argued it's the most universalist of all. I mean, lamas will whisper mantras to insects. You summon spirits and then you preach to them at the end of your practice. It couldn't be more kind of evangelical in some ways, and yet at the same time, Tibetan Buddhism is very much kind of ethno-nationalist phenomenon as well, and Tibetans are dispossessed people who are desperately struggling to kind of keep together a coherent vision of their nation and their culture and their history and identity in exile. And so it really adds layers of complexity to all of these exchanges. And I got an initial taste of that in the kind of far-flung sort of exiled Tibetan Siberia of South African suburbia for these sort of lonely Tibetan families who are doing this work, and it's really just led me to interact with Tibetans more and more, and realize the absolute kind of heterogeneity of the Tibetan experience in exile and inside Tibet, but also the kind of, at times, the political urgency of homogenizing identities and experience as well. So, and sort of standardizing and preserving practices versus letting them sort of die or change or circulate too freely. And I find these kinds of dynamics fascinating, especially, I guess, because I began as sort of just a kid in South Africa who was just sort of consuming as much information as possible. And I think many Western esotericists can relate to with the enormous syncretism and hybridity that exists, and the kind of fractured nature of lineages and the constant claims and forgeries and new claims. And I think that all of us have this experience of sort of cannibalizing, and certainly chaos magic has taken that on in very interesting ways. But I've always been interested in understanding how that works in practice and how that's lived. And I love the idea of my work providing a space in which, Tibetan refugees can engage with and speak back to, Kenneth Grant or Madame Blavatsky or whatever. And I think, some of the stuff I put on my blog has really been very kind of fledgling steps to try to use anthropology to create a field where these different voices and histories and these different stakes can all meet each other in the middle, and we see what happens.
Well, if you were interested in that complexity and hybridity, you've definitely picked the sort of topic area that is that par excellence. I mean, we should probably talk through. I'm very interested. I agree, and I'm interested in observing it and thinking about its implications. Such as we can say these things, a Tibetan worldview or cosmology, so we can't really say them, but go with me, is already a dizzying blend by virtue of the geography of Tibet before it ends up in diaspora. So you have the universalist component with a oversimplifying, universal-ish earlier systems underneath it, and these things are a blend and a transformation, and at some point you have to, and this is happening with kind of the emergence of world religions out of Brazil and so on as well. At some point you have to how do we think about indigeneity, and this is a Brazilian or this is a Tibetan practice, but also give them or allow them the agency to do that transformation and to become some kind of crazy, exciting world mutant?
I mean, I'm not sure if that was a question, um, or just a provocation, but I think for me, my go-to, and maybe this is also because my advisor she holds a PhD in history and anthropology, and that's definitely rubbed off on me, but it suits my proclivities as well. But I think for me, um, what I always go back to is history. I think that we can always do with more historicizing. I think one of the, this has always been one of the biggest challenges of claims made in the Western esoteric magical traditions. Like, this question of historicity and mythic history or magical history. But I think in a broader kind of scholarly sense, the need to historicize these transformations, these mutations, as you say, and also the more we do that, the more we can contextualize what's happening in the present with what's happened in the past, and the better equipped we are to also imagine maybe more benign and collaborative futures. I've never felt that the academic critical study of the history of esotericisms should be threatening to practitioners. And I think a lot of the listeners and the interviewees on your show probably feel the same way, because I think and of course, with the work you've done, I know that history is very important. But yeah, for me, that's the key thing. It's like we were saying before we went on air, anthropologists have tended to look at contemporary lived experience. And then in Buddhist studies, a lot of research has been very textual and historical and linguistic and philological. And I think that anthropology is often ranked lower because it's seen as just sort of folksy and what people are doing, and it's not backed by the kind of the weight of the scripture and the text. But even those texts need to be contextualized in terms of how they were practiced in the past. And I find again and again in my research now, looking at the kind of contemporary developments in Tibetan tantric non-celibate ritual specialist lineages, what Tibetans call Ngakpa, looking at Ngakpa and how Ngakpa lineages are being practiced today, I just can't make sense of what's happening now if I don't look back, 14 centuries, if I don't look back to the very beginnings of the very emergence of Buddhism in Tibet and beyond. So for me, I just feel like history is our best friend in this pursuit.
Yes. When I was talking to Kai about hoodoo and generally American folk magic, I think history is our best friend is kind of a our best solve there as well, because the increasing your understanding of history increases the context that allows or that facilitates either an awareness of ownership or journey for the parts that it belongs to, and with that knowledge you can then look at how it interacts with particularly when it comes to magic, look at how it interacts with the wider world. Like it's the least worst option for running that appropriation risk, and it doesn't matter wherever you are with it. History allows you to associate cultural journeys in a way that means you can maybe have the discussions in a more sensitive way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the case of Tibetan Buddhism, converts to Tibetan Buddhism, often they will say, "Well, look, you got Buddhism from India." When the Siddhas came from India and saw what you guys were doing here a few centuries in, they were scandalized, and they also said, "What is this strange bastardized thing that you have produced?" And they wanted to clean that stuff up, and they, of course, an exchange was still happening, but so you can always say like, "Oh, don't accuse me of cultural appropriation or insensitivity when you yourselves have been appropriators in the past." But that's a classic go-to on sort of online comment threads. But I find that's not good enough either,
No,
because
that's
if
gross.
you're not, it's definitely not good enough. I mean, if you're truly not historically tone deaf, then you will also simultaneously have to take into consideration the unique historical circumstances of Tibetans today as they live, both in exile and within Chinese occupied Tibet. That has to be a key factor in your thinking about, the exchange of knowledge and cultural practices. And so, it's just, we always have to just be quite exacting, and we have to have a kind of equal dispensation in terms of how we apply our historical lens, and not use it for bad faith arguments alone to just bolster a defensive position. Who wouldn't want to have a collaborative exchange with the very people who helped author the traditions which you've now been invited inside of? Why would you not want to do that? Why would you want to shut that down
Yeah,
defensively?
is your goal some sense of, or a priority some sense of authenticity or not? I mean, are you just robbing the shop?
Yeah, it's never really made sense to me. I mean, I think, again, if we just take stock of where we're at, then we're better positioned in order to engage on all levels. And my desire, at any rate, is to make everybody feel like their perspective is welcome, and it's welcome because it's going to be open to critique. No one is kind of exempted from that in some way, including the anthropologist who's writing about it. And so I think in some ways that makes everybody more honest.
Yeah.
And I think as practitioners, we need to always keep that in mind. There's
I
always
like
so much.
Yeah, I like what you said about nobody is exempted from critique, like the discourse happens or not, because the other part of going in the opposite direction, and this is where I used Hoodoo as the example, is you get into some kind of you get back to a sort of European romantic view of different cultures and kind of pristine noble savages by walling off in that really imperialist early anthropological way. This is what these people do and this is what those people do, and that's as unsatisfying as robbing the shop. And as you say, it seems like the the only way, or the least worst way of doing this is increasing the voices and making sure no one is above critique in that discussion.
Right. And like, one of the biggest critiques of this ontological turn in anthropology, which sort of is trying to take small scale indigenous societies, worldview is the wrong word, but sort of ontological realities, and use them as a counterpoint against what's seen as kind of the gross errors of Western materialism. Like, what the obvious error that potentially makes or has made is cultural essentialism. It boxes in a whole group of people, non-Westerns, non-moderns, and it potentially makes the classic errors of early sort of race sciencey anthropology, where it assumes that some people just think a certain way, they exist in a different world, in a cosmology, and that world is ghettoized from the world of sort of the disenchanted West. And one of the great sort of counterpoints that a lot of people have made in these discussions is they've said, look, and listeners should know this as well, even in indigenous contexts, if you're looking at sort of magical systems, religious systems, internal to those systems, there's all kinds of political dynamics, controversies, complexities, and skepticism. In anthropology, we have these two terms, emic and etic, and often sort of, students in the beginning sort of lazily equate the etic perspective to the outside, objective, sort of critical scientist's perspective on, say, witchcraft. And the emic perspective is what the native themselves believes from the perspective of being inside the culture. But, right away, you collapse those things, because you realize that within communities of practitioners, native practitioners, whoever exactly those people are, There are emic and etic dynamics happening all the time. People are taking different positions on their own experiences and cultural institutions and practices all the time. It wasn't like it's a nonsense view to imagine that there's some sort of timeless sphere of native experience or ontology, and then, a bunch of kind of hungry Westerners want to cannibalize that, and they're sort of on the periphery, either trying to, as you say, steal or just romanticize and pretend that world is insulated from any possible kind of self-reflexivity or internal controversy or change or this is maybe it's a bit of a strange example, but I've been thinking a lot. I've been working on a piece about how anthropologists have written about sort of the history of this, how they've written about reincarnation as a concept. And I discovered something very interesting in doing that research and sort of just taking stock of what had been written. A lot of anthropologists who sort of ended up devoting their careers to the study of reincarnation sort of went down a particular path. They decided that their Western kind of modern socialization, whatever exactly that is, had made them blind to such a concept as reincarnation, and it made them misunderstand certain ideas about personhood and temporality and all these things. And so they kind of went on a mission to show that reincarnation was real, basically. And so some of the kind of most dogged anthropologists of reincarnation ended up really becoming empiricists. They were trying to find proof. Ian Stevenson, who's an ex-psychiatrist who got very involved in these cases by recording sort of amazing data, don't get me wrong, of thousands of cases of children across the world who remembered previous lives. His goal was to find the clean case that would persuade the most atheist, materialist scientist of the absolute reality of the continuation of consciousness post-death. And I find the whole thing quite interesting because if you look at Tibetan society, I mean, reincarnation became a means of political succession. It became a vital, inherent part of everyday life and politics, economics. Its impact is felt in so many areas of life. But even for those Tibetans who kind of were not too bothered about the ontological reality of transmigration or reincarnation or what have you, they still recognize the human dimensions, the messy, historical, human, political dimensions of reincarnation politics. Even those people who, it was never a very interesting question to ask whether reincarnation happened. Reincarnate lamas themselves, with past life memories, never discredited the social or human dimensions. And yet what you find with some of these researchers is this strong desire to kind of excise those elements to get to a kind of pure experience or reality. And I always think of it like this: even if we could, like, I don't know, I think I mentioned to you earlier, if you're an anthropologist who wants to study spirits or who wants to study extraterrestrials, you have to do that by studying people. That doesn't mean you can't have your own experiences with spirits and write autobiographically about that or record other people's ones, but you're a person too, and so you have to acknowledge your positionality as well. So whether you like it or not, you're stuck in the humanities, even when you're trying to go beyond them. And it's just interesting to me that often people have this urge to, especially when I can understand it, fringe science, you've got a lot to prove, And so what I was finding in looking at this research is that people are really trying to, you see they're trying very hard to remove what I guess you could call the anecdotal, messy, kind of unreliable dimensions of these experiences. But we all know that, magic, for example, is kind of one of the most...
It's dodgy.
it's dodgy and it's
that's what it
human.
is. Exactly. And
yeah. It's also about transhuman realities as well. But I've just never understood why the contingency of these things and the kind of politicized nature of these things, the historical, contextual, cultural specificities of these things are so threatening to certain practitioners and scholars.
The stakes are high. With fringe science, I don't know if you've seen the OA, but the stakes are high.
If I have seen the OA.
Yeah, there you go. If you get reincarnation right, like you'll mow the Himalayas to get proof of of reincarnation, because of in their heads the stakes are high, and unfortunately you do get that limiting or literal whitewashing of the messiness. That, as you say, like reincarnation is a component of, or still is a component of a political structure, which means it's experienced by Tibetans in the same way that anything else is. It's liable to corruption, it's messy, there are people talking in the back room, and that doesn't invalidate the fact that these things appear to have there are good data that suggest that there are young humans who have memories of lives that they probably haven't lived, at least not in that body. And these two things.
I mean, the anecdotal evidence, at the very least, is absolutely overwhelming.
Sure.
Astounding. But I mean, and then in terms of anthropology as well, and research that gets done, you have medical anthropologists writing about diabetes. They're writing about genetic analysis. They're writing about things that, radiation toxicity, things that are not really fringe science or in question, but still they're writing about the social, historical, political, economic, cultural dimensions of these things. And no one's too worried about that. But as you say, the stakes are very different when it comes to scholarship on these kinds of subjects.
So let's bundle that up into some advice for the amateur researchers out there, because people listening to the show are, and for very good reasons, because the stakes are high, are interested in the problematic though it is, expressions of the anomalous around the world. So if you can boil it down to either, here are a couple of books that are readily accessible that people may be interested in, or here is a way of thinking when you go looking at different stuff, just some passing anthropological advice for the layman, Ben.
I mean, one thing I can say just at the outset is that I don't think I, as a graduate student, could be as capable of doing this kind of work if I didn't have excellent interlocutors in academia right now to do this. Even 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to write about certain topics and kind of make citations that would allow other scholars and just anyone reading to realize that there is a body of scholarship, that this is, it's difficult when writing and reading about esotericism, because, you have to kind of take as I'm sure you have to take the hands of the reader a certain way before you can even get to the point where you want to have make your fun conclusions or your provocations. So definitely I would say we're in a time now where esotericism is being taken on somewhat more seriously, or just kind of with more stamina than maybe it has been in the past. So of course there's now there are academic programs. There's Jeffrey Kripal has his department up in Texas. It's the only kind of department right now looking at the study of esotericism and Gnosticism in the U.S. Scandinavia and the Netherlands are doing well as well in that. And I'm certainly indebted to that kind of work that's been done, that then allows me to put anthropological research in line with stuff that's being done from a more kind of historical perspective on esotericism. But I guess it's a little bit difficult for me to say, because, anthropologists have been writing about witchcraft for the last 150 years at least. That's kind of the origins of our discipline. the claim that whether or not you believe in witches, the study of witchcraft can tell you something about particular societies, and that it's connected with a sort of internal social logic. And so that hasn't ever really gone away. I mean, it's funny that I should say that maybe it's a bit difficult to write as an academic about esotericism and kind of fringy things, because in some ways that's what anthropologists have always done. They've always gone to kind of the limits of what seems normal or natural or possible, and try to reflect on that and experience that and engage with that. So for listeners, it's hard. There's so much. I mean, anthropologists are, I wish, put it this way, that more practicing magicians and occultists were engaging with anthropological writing. I think they're not, because of academic paywalls and because of the dreariness of publications and just the total inaccessibility of them. But I think that we really are seeing a movement towards open access journals. Cultural anthropology is now providing all kinds of wonderful short form essays and multimedia things that readers can follow up to get a more immersive experience when they read scholarly pieces of ethnographic work. My own blog, I'm trying to do something similar by just writing more accessible things and always including links to online material. So I understand it can be difficult, but I think that, honestly, Google Scholar is also your friend. So much more material is being made available. And really, I just, what I would say is that I would apologize, is that anthropologists have not, they've not tried very hard to truly make themselves accessible to non-academics. And I think what I love about doing the work in the intersections that I'm doing it in is that, I get to engage with non-academic and academic Tibetans, Tibetan Buddhist practitioners of all kinds, occultists and magicians from various traditions. And I feel like, for me, I want everyone to be able to come together and feel like their knowledge is valued. We have this axiom in anthropology. We say everyone is it sounds like Robert Anton Wilson a little bit, but kind of like everyone is everyone is an expert in their own experience when it comes to their own experience. And we really do believe that. Like, we're going to apply that experience and compare it with other perspectives. But people should feel that anthropological information is useful and available to them.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's this stuff, and I found that over the course of doing the show and having people email once Starships came out, that I think people outside of academia, it's not just, for instance, it's not just anthropologists who haven't made themselves available. That's kind of culturally been what academia has done for 800 years in Northwest Europe. That is changing. That's changing across different fields, because I think what people outside don't realize is that you'll find a lot on the inside of academia who are kind of aware that they and really appreciate the idea that they're not just doing their work in a vacuum that's just going to be read by a few hundred other people doing similar work. It's very validating to be doing something about the world for the world and have the world engage with it. So we could actually turn that into a piece of advice that sort of follows up what you were saying about Google Scholar and even places like, with some caveats, academia.edu and so on. The information belongs to the world. That's kind of what it's for. So you don't feel kind of weird, even if it's alien to start with. If anything, that's good. Don't feel kind of weird by diving in or even asking questions.
Well, right, yeah. And I read something a while back that said that the average academic publication is read 0 times.
Yeah.
One behind a paywall anyway. And things are really changing right now. We have journals in anthropology like Howl, Journal of Ethnographic Theory, that actually writes, there's a lot of material on there about the ontological turn, animism, theorizing of magic, enormous amount of material, somewhat dense, but useful potentially for practitioners as well. And as I said, anthropologists always were aware that they were producing partial, well, maybe not always, but now are all aware that they produce partial representations of narrative that point towards some kinds of experiences and try to extrapolate from those. But the work will never end because situations will change. Field sites will be transformed, informants will die and be born, and for me, it's been a very interesting experience because so many of my contacts and leads in terms of my PhD fieldwork have been mediated by the internet. I'm working very closely right now with a Tibetan Lama and traditional Tibetan medical doctor. We're working on publications together. His name is Dr. Nida Chenatsang, and he's one of probably I don't think there probably isn't a Tibetan who's writing in the Tibetan language as much as he is about Tibetan magic and Tibetan medicine, and especially the connections, yoga, magic, and medicine, and the connections between those three. And I was reading his work in Tibetan and translating little excerpts on Facebook, and that was how I made contact with him. I didn't even know he was living in Europe and wasn't in Eastern Tibet. And because of that, because he appreciated the work I was doing, now we're working much more closely on other projects, which are great.
That's really cool. That's hooray! There are some good parts to the 21st century. I think that's fun. But Ben, we've taken up enough of your time. So for people who are interested in specifically what you just said and other information by you, where do they go to find out?
I haven't updated my blog now in at least 2 months, but they are welcome to go to it. It's the address is www.perfumedskull, so PERFUMEDSKULL, all one word, .com. And the pieces on there usually have an anthropological bent. Some of the stuff is translations from Tibetan. But yeah, I think that should give readers some idea of the kind of things I'm interested in. And as I say in the About Me section, I really want people to feel like they can engage, whoever they may be, and share information, ideas, reactions. I really do think that public anthropology is valuable. And, for me, it's ludicrous that I would be doing research and writing a PhD and developing a career based on the experiences of Tibetans and not make that work in progress available to Tibetans themselves who know English at any rate to engage with, And yeah. So I would hope that any other kind of reader would do the same.
Well, this has been fascinating. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. This has been a brilliant talk. So Ben, thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
There you have it. The Tibetan diaspora experience, the uses and misuses of anthropology, the limitations of the ontological turn, reincarnation and its discontents, and child labour in the South African divination industry. Good times. For more good times, subscribe to the show in iTunes, on YouTube, or in your favourite podcatcher. Say hello at the RuneSoup Facebook page or at runesoup.com. Otherwise, find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.